because we're already behind since I sent you the wrong video. So let's start with Shakespeare's background. I might say, make a couple of comments about the syllabus, but probably not. Well, you got a good introduction. If you watch that lecture, you got a good introduction to early British history and the Anglo-Saxon kind of background, but that has nothing to do with Shakespeare until we get to, say, King Lear, which we will get to, God willing. So, how many of you have had a course of some kind in Shakespeare before? One. How many of you have read anything by Shakespeare before? You have to say yes, because you read something in high school, even if it was Romeo and Juliet or Julius Caesar, because for some odd reason, those are the two plays that are usually assigned in high school, and they're probably two of the worst plays to be assigned to high schoolers. I mean, do we really want high schoolers committing suicide? Okay. How many of you have seen a Shakespeare play performed? Most of you, that's good. Because I'm going to give you an opportunity for extra credit. Over the next 3 weeks, Nashville Shakespeare Festival is completing their run of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is why we're starting with it this semester, up at Centennial Park for the next 2 weekends, this weekend and the next weekend. Yeah. And then Franklin Academy Park in Franklin the weekend of September 13th through the 16th. And I'll give you more information about what you need to do for that. I'll probably post it on D2L. So if you've never seen one, or if you've never seen A Midsummer Night's Dream, you'll get to see, if you want to do the extra credit, you'll get to see their production / version of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Okay, so back up. Shakespeare was born late April 1564. We don't know the exact date of his birth. We do have a baptismal certificate, but we don't have a birth certificate. Yes, they did have birth certificates back then. Based upon his baptismal certificate, it's usually assumed he was born on April 23rd. One of the other reasons we kind of make that assumption is it balances nicely with his death, because he dies on April 23rd, 1616. 52 years old. Okay? I'm 4 years older than Shakespeare was when he died. And he did a hell of a lot more with his life than I've done. We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay? So, late April 1564. Who's a monarch when he's born? Anybody know? Queen Elizabeth I. Okay? She became queen in 1558. She rules until 1603, one of the longest reigns in English history. Okay? There have been a couple that have been longer. The current Queen Elizabeth, she outdoes them all, by the way. And Queen Victoria ruled 60 years. Okay? So he's born not in the middle of the Elizabethan period. He's born towards the beginning of the Elizabethan period. But he's born kind of in the middle of the Tudor period. Okay? Elizabeth's father was Henry VIII, who was the son of Henry VII, whose real name is Henry Tudor. Okay? He became king in 1485 when he defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. If we were reading Richard III, we would read Shakespeare's famous lines that he puts into the mouth of Richard, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. So he's born in 1564. What's going on in 1564? What religion, or let me put it differently, what form of Christianity is dominant in England in 1564? Catholicism or Protestantism? Protestantism. Why? Because Henry VIII institutes the quote-unquote Protestant Reformation in 1536. Right? He dies, his young son, Edward VI, then becomes king for a few years. He kind of pushes it farther to the Protestant realm, okay, largely because of his advisors, because he's pretty young when he becomes king, 12 or 13. He dies only a few years later. His sister, half-sister, they're all half, sisters, brothers, becomes queen. Mary, from whom we get a nickname. Bloody Mary, or get a drink from her. Okay? She's Catholic. She is not nominally Catholic. She is full-bore Catholic. Okay? To the extent that she starts persecuting Protestants. That's why we get the Bloody Mary. Persecuting, burning at the stake, okay, hanging, having their tongues cut out, having their fingers cut off, for writing bad things about her, that kind of stuff. She dies under, strange circumstances, but she dies, and Elizabeth becomes queen. When Elizabeth becomes queen, she kind of takes, initially, a Bill Clinton-ish don't ask, don't tell policy. That is, if you want to be Catholic, fine, be Catholic. Just don't be open about it. If you want to hold secret masses, fine. Just don't go advertising it. Okay? Parliament, however, is a little bit more Protestant than she is. Okay? And in the early 1560s, Parliament starts passing laws against Catholicism. Okay? One of the laws, for example, that is passed says that in churches, okay, if there is religious iconography on the walls, paintings of saints, paintings of biblical stories and such, they have to be whitewashed over. They have to be covered. Why? Because according to the Protestants, that was what? Idolatry. Idolatry. Okay? Why? Because what does one of the Ten Commandments say? Thou shalt have no graven image. Which, if you take that literally, means what? No pictures. No representative pictures of people. Okay? And if you're Muslim, you practice that. That's why you can't have an image of Muhammad. Okay? So, Shakespeare's father, when he was born, was the mayor of Stratford. That means when Parliament passes laws, it falls to him to make sure those laws are executed. Okay? If you go to Stratford today and go to the Guildhall Church in Stratford, you can see the images that John Shakespeare plastered over. Let me rephrase that. Whitewashed over. Poorly. What do I mean poorly? He didn't use several coats of whitewash or paint so that you can still see the image through. Now, there's been all kinds of questions. Why didn't he do a good job? The answer generally given is because the Shakespeares were Catholic. We know, historically, you go beyond William Shakespeare himself to his parents and his parents' parents. They were Catholic. Okay, for a couple of reasons. One, John Shakespeare was born before, or just around the time that Henry VIII breaks off from Rome. Okay? So, just before then, there wasn't a Protestant church. So everybody was Catholic. All right? But it appears that, and we know this also historically from that section of kind of the northwestern Midlands of England, that was a fairly religiously conservative area. Okay? Meaning, we don't go along with much change. So the way it's always been done is the way we like it to be done still, which would mean the Catholic form of Christianity. So it's probably the case that, okay, I'm going to obey the laws, but I'm going to do it as ineffectually as I can, so that those who are secret Catholics can still see that imagery in the church. And now you have to understand, when Henry VIII broke from Rome, Ideologically, he didn't really. That is, in terms of what Henry believed and what he said the English church taught, they still believed in saints. They still prayed to saints. They still prayed to Mary. Okay? It was more of a political break. Why? Because Henry wanted the divorce, and he wanted to be able to do what he wanted and to make himself head of the English church. So he could call all the shots, essentially. Okay? But 20 years after that point, 30 years after that point, when Shakespeare's a 2-year-old, that change became much more centrally around the kind of the pillar ideas of the church. In other words, the Protestants in the 1560s, you don't pray to saints. There's one mediator between God and man, Jesus. That's it. You only pray to Jesus. You don't pray to anybody else. You don't have any aids to prayer, like visual aids, crosses, icons, etc. Okay? So one of the things that happened when Henry made that break, okay, again, think of it, it's more political. Well, when Henry became king, who was the largest landowner in Britain? The church. The church. So when Henry breaks from Rome, guess who becomes the largest landholder in Britain? It's still the church. Only now it's the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and who's the head? Henry becomes the crown, essentially. So Henry sets about a process of what later gets called the dissolution of the monasteries. What does that mean? Dissolution. He dissolves the monasteries. Well, it's not like he pours acid on them and they dissolve. What does he do? He kicks the monks out, literally. Kicks the monks and nuns out of the monasteries that they live in. So they all become essentially overnight. That is from the time when Henry's representatives go to Monastery A and say, okay, you have to be vacated from these premises by such and such a date. By such and such a date, they're gone. It doesn't mean that the crown says you can move to, no. They become homeless. At the same time as Parliament has passed laws against homelessness. I mean, they literally had laws against being homeless and against being poor. So it was illegal to be poor. Wrap your mind around that one for a minute. And we think we've got bad government. Okay? So what else happens? So you get all these people who are suddenly out on the streets. Okay. What else? Well, the monasteries, for the most part, in the Middle Ages, the monasteries are the repositories of learning. See, the monasteries exist long before Oxford and Cambridge. Oxford, the university, doesn't come into existence until the 12th century. Cambridge a little bit later. The monasteries have been around several hundred years before that. Okay? So it's the monasteries that preserve these in manuscript form. Okay? When Henry dissolves the monasteries, what happens to these? Well, some of them, many of them, are burned. Why? Because the Protestants who take over the monasteries, who are selling off the property, see these as being nothing but full of Catholic nonsense. So a lot of manuscripts get burned and destroyed. That is, destroyed, taken apart, so that they could use the cover of a manuscript or a sheet in a manuscript as the cover of a book, because covers were made out of leather. Vellum, the pages, is nothing but very, very, very thin leather. It's calfskin, essentially. Right? So it's probably during the dissolution of the monasteries that we lose, the estimate, rough estimate is about 90% of the literature of medieval England. 90. We have one copy of Beowulf. We have one copy of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, two of the most important works of the Middle Ages in England. Okay? Probably because any other copies were destroyed as a result of the dissolution of the monasteries, not the Viking invasions that happened a few hundred years before Henry. Okay? So Shakespeare is born into this milieu, this climate of anti-Catholicism. His father has to enforce these laws when he might be against the laws. Okay? And so Shakespeare's born into this. Well, what else goes on? He grows up. His father is, as I said, for a while he's mayor of Stratford. He's also a leather worker. Okay? Makes shoes and gloves, primarily gloves. Okay? And Shakespeare grows up probably learning that trade. You can go to the house Shakespeare grew up in Stratford, see what it looked like at the time. They've got kind of some schlocky stuff up now. He probably went to the local school, King Edward VI, okay, grammar school, named after the young king after Henry VIII. If you go there today, it's only open a few days of the year for tourists to come in. Last time my whole family and I were in England, 2013, I think. We were in Stratford, and it just happened to be one of the days that they were open. So you could go in, and you could go into the main lecture hall, and sit at the seat that anecdotal evidence says Shakespeare was assigned to sit at, etc. You can go up to the rooms and all that. It's pretty cool. But what kind of education would he have received? Because this is grammar school. This is our understanding grade school. Essentially 6 through 11 or 12. Well, much of it would have been conducted in Latin, especially after the first couple of years, because they would have begun learning Latin at about the age of 6. Started Greek just a couple of years later. Okay? By the time Shakespeare would have left that, at 11, 12, possibly 13, slow learner, don't think so. He probably would have known as much Latin and Greek as a modern classics major graduating from a university. MTSU doesn't have a classics major. Sewanee does. Shakespeare at 11 or 12 would have known as much classics at 11 or 12 as a 22-year-old Sewanee graduate with a classics major. Okay? Which means pretty good Latin and Greek. Okay? How would he have learned Latin? Well, they would start off very easy at the beginning with paradigms, memorizing, the cases of verbs and how you decline the verbs, etc., or the cases of nouns and how you decline the verbs and the various declensions and all that kind of stuff. But eventually they would have gotten to the point where, let's say this is Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. This is much bigger than Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. But they would have had a portion of the Gallic Wars in Latin, and the headmaster would say, translate that into English. And so the student would write on a slate translation of a portion of that into English. That's only part of it. Then you take your translation without the aid of the original and translate that back into Latin. And it had to match the original in order for it to be deemed appropriate. If you've ever taken a foreign language and translated, that's the hard part. Getting your translation translated back into the original language and having it match. Okay? Shakespeare apparently could do that fairly well because some of the sources for some of his plays were only available in Latin. We also know some of the sources for some of his plays were only available in French, so he knew French. He knew French, he knew Latin, he knew Greek. We're fairly certain he knew Italian, and he possibly knew some German. Okay? Yet he never went to university. As far as we know, he does not show up, he does not exist in any university rolls. So he didn't go to Oxford, he didn't go to Cambridge. All right? 1582, he is, what, 18? He meets Anne Hathaway. She's 26. She's 26 and unmarried, which means in Elizabethan England, she's old and a spinster. If she's 26 and unmarried, she's not likely to get married. But they meet, and within a few months, they get married. They do not get married in Stratford. Okay? In a few months after that, she gives birth to their first child, Susanna. Notice, it's like 3 months after that. Okay, so this is a shotgun wedding. Not sure who's holding the shotgun, her father or Shakespeare's, but it's a shotgun wedding of sorts. Okay? In Shakespeare's day, in order to be married, one of the rituals of the English church is you have the banns read. Okay? The banns still show up in the English ceremony, show up in some Protestant ceremonies here too and such. And that's the, if anyone knows any reason why these two people should not get married, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. Today, that's kind of, when that's used, it's in the actual ceremony itself. The banns are when that statement is announced. I always get this wrong. It's either 3 consecutive Sundays before the wedding or one Sunday, 3 consecutive months before the wedding. I think it's 3 consecutive Sundays. So that, if you miss church for some reason and you have a good reason for why they shouldn't get married and you do show up, it gives you an opportunity to say, no, they shouldn't get married because, okay? These were never read, apparently. All right? So they get married. They have their first child, Susanna, 1583. A couple of years later, they have twins, Hamnet and Judith. 1585, Hamnet dies. It's in your introduction, and I'm blanking out. I want to say very late 1590s. Like 98, 99, or maybe right around 1600. Might even be 1596. He doesn't live long. He doesn't make it, I don't believe, to his teenage years. Okay? Judith lives longer. Judith and Susanna go on to marry, etc. Okay? And then from 1585 to 92, we have what are often called the lost years. Your book calls them the dark years. Okay? They're called the lost years or the dark years because Shakespeare goes dark. We don't know what he's doing. We have no documentary evidence of where he is or what he's doing for roughly a period of 7 years. In 1585, we've got the birth certificates for Hamnet and Judith, and he's mentioned. So we know where he is. But it's like after that, he drops off the grid completely. Next thing we know, next thing we hear is, I think it's 1592, when Robert Greene, this is in your introduction, writes this long pamphlet called A Groat's Worth of Wit and something else of repentance. Now, Robert Greene is a hack writer. If he were alive today, he'd be the kind of guy writing novels that show up on the checkout stand at the grocery store. I mean, just churns them out. Okay? But he's not very good. And what he's writing in this pamphlet is he's sick and dying, and he's kind of taking his last parting shot at the cruel literary world for not paying attention to his brilliance. And he mentions in there an upstart crow who has feathered himself with kind of our lines who imagines himself to be a shake scene in a country. And he takes these two, he has these two passages that are paraphrases from two of Shakespeare's works. He doesn't name William Shakespeare, but everybody who reads it says he's talking about Shakespeare. And he's saying this guy Shakespeare is the new talk of the town. This is in 1592. We don't think it's the case that Shakespeare moves to London in July of 1592 and Greene all of a sudden takes notice of him and writes about him. I think it's in about September that he writes this. We tend to think Shakespeare's been in London for a while. A while meaning a year or two. But we have no proof. We have no evidence. We don't know what he was doing during that 7 years. It might be he's already been writing plays. You'll see in the introductions to some of the plays we do, if you read other introductions, some editors think he was beginning his playwriting as far back as 1588. One of the Henry VI plays. It's sometimes dated 1588-89. Okay? Comedy of Errors is sometimes dated 1589, 1590. We don't know. We do know he's in London 1592, and he is having plays produced. Because we have other writers who refer in things like journals to having seen XYZ play. Okay? And this is how we know when some of Shakespeare's plays are actually produced. We have other writers who make note of having seen Love's Labour's Lost, having seen Romeo and Juliet, having seen, and they list all of Shakespeare's plays that they've seen at that time. Francis Mears is one in his Palladis Timnia, and then the other one is a writer for the Lord Admiral's Men, Geoffrey, what's his name? Australian actor who played him in Shakespeare in Love. Henslow. Geoffrey Rush played this character in Shakespeare in Love, this other writer was an actor in the Lord Admiral's Men and a producer. He put on their plays. Okay? He wrote down, kept a journal of kind of the plays that were going on in London at the time, and he tells us in the late 1590s of all of these plays of Shakespeare's that he's seen. Without that, we wouldn't have evidence of when Shakespeare's plays have been produced. So some of those things that are talked about in the lengthy introduction at the beginning are pretty informative for telling us what Shakespeare plays are being produced at what time. Some of them are produced simultaneously. And we know the Lord Chamberlain's Men and then later the King's Men, same group of players for the most part, are putting on multiple plays at once. Like if you go to the Globe Theater today, or during their summer production, they're putting on 3 or 4 plays at once. So you might see Titus Andronicus on a Monday night. Tuesday night you might see Lear. Thursday night you might see Comedy of Errors. And a Saturday night you might see a 4th play. Which means all those actors have memorized all those plays. And it just keeps going. And then they do another 4 plays during the winter, and then another 4 plays during the next year, etc. Some of the copies of some of the plays that we have, we believe are what are called memorial reconstructions. That is, actors from competing companies have gotten a ticket, they've gone to the play, and they've watched the play, and they've memorized it as it was being played. And then they go back to their room and scribble it all out as fast as they can. Okay? Other copies we think are produced from Shakespeare's, what are called fair copies. His handwritten manuscript without cross-throughs and all that kind of stuff. Okay? But we don't have any of those. We don't have any of Shakespeare's plays, entire plays, in his own hand. We've got portions of some plays where we can see Shakespeare's handwriting. We know Shakespeare's handwriting because he left behind 6 signatures in wills and legal documents. And in those 6 signatures, he spells his name 3 different ways. Shakespeare, Shakespeare, Shakespeare. Okay? Which we'll talk about what that does for people who say Shakespeare isn't Shakespeare in a moment. Okay? So, early 1590s, he's in London. By 1592, he's part of what are called the Lord Chamberlain's men. Okay? Lord Chamberlain's men are a group of actors who are supported by the Lord Chamberlain. That's it. He is their patron. Okay? Who's the Lord Chamberlain? He's like the second most important person in the country, behind the Queen. He has the Queen's ear. So, because they are patronized by him, they are considered kind of like his, this is a somewhat archaic term by the time Shakespeare's around, but they're like his knights. So, they have a status in society. It's not like our today Hollywood celebrities. Because actors still in Shakespeare's day, you know, they're shady characters. We'll talk about that a little bit. They stay Lord Chamberlain's men until 1603. The Queen doesn't have an acting troupe that she patronizes. Though she apparently, again, based on anecdotal evidence, she did apparently favor the Lord Chamberlain's men because she favored Shakespeare. In fact, Shakespeare, again, anecdotal evidence. We have no hard proof of this. It is said this was the case. Shakespeare wrote an entire play just to please the Queen after she had seen the Henry IV plays. He writes The Merry Wives of Windsor because she wants to see more of Sir John Falstaff. And so he writes a play about this fat old fallen knight trying to get in and out of the beds of the wives of Windsor. Okay? 1603, Queen Elizabeth dies. And you get King James VI of Scotland, who becomes King James I of England. Okay? Starts the Stuart monarchy. The Lord Chamberlain's men then become the King's men. The King becomes their patron. So whatever status they had as Lord Chamberlain's men now rises a little bit. Okay? And Shakespeare stays as one of the King's men until he leaves London. We're not sure exactly when he leaves London. It might be as early as 1611. It might be, I know I've got 1612 here, it might be as late as 13. Okay? We're not exactly sure about the date that he leaves. We do know that he leaves. He goes back to Stratford, where Anne has lived all these years. Okay? And he lives there for the last 3, 4, maybe 5 years of his life. And one of the interesting things is Shakespeare leaves London and you don't hear a word about him again. I mean, you would think Shakespeare, who other writers are praising while he's around in London, that there would be scuttlebutt, gossip of some sort that would show up in journals, letters, things. Nothing. Again, it's like he falls off the face of the earth. He dies in 1616 and nothing. You know, we're going to be hearing until Sunday, I think it is, when he's finally buried, we're going to be hearing about John McCain until then. Okay? Comparing the two in their time period, Shakespeare was more important than John McCain. And he dies, and there's nothing. There aren't any funeral poems written about him in 1616, which is what commonly happens. We have little books of funeral poems written about much, much lesser or more minor poets, by people celebrating them as, you know, the latest incarnation of Apollo, etc. Nothing about Shakespeare until 1623. And in 1623, the other members of the Lord Chamberlain's men and King's men produce this. It's the first folio. I'll pass it around. It's the first folio. It's the first collected edition of all of Shakespeare's plays. Okay. Prior to this, Shakespeare's plays, some of them had been printed in what is called quarto. This is folio. Folio, you have a big sheet of paper, you fold it once. Okay? So you have 2 sheets, 4 pages. Okay? You fold that sheet again, and you then have a quarto. Okay? Because now you have 4 sheets and 8 pages. You could fold it again, and fold it again, and fold it again, and you get, in the Renaissance, in the period that Shakespeare's writing, and I've seen them, I've held them, you've got books that are literally like the size, like 2 inches, that are whole, one sheet folded a whole bunch of times, like, so that you get 32 pages in 32 leaves in 64 pages. Okay, little tiny books of prayers, for example. Okay? And then you have big things like this, right? Well, when this is published, 1623, it's got some dedicatory poems at the beginning about Shakespeare, the most famous one being by Ben Jonson. Long poem, where Jonson, says Shakespeare was not for an age, but for all time, etc. And where he also says Shakespeare knew little Latin and less Greek. And a lot of people latched on that, a lot of scholars latched on that to say, look, Jonson said Shakespeare knew little Latin and less Greek. They took that to mean Shakespeare didn't know Latin and Greek. It's not what Jonson means. Jonson means Shakespeare knew little Latin and less Greek compared to me. Okay? Well, Ben Jonson was a master of Latin and Greek. As I said, if Shakespeare's knowledge of Latin and Greek were like a classics major graduating after 4 years, Jonson's was like his PhD tutor. So Jonson's knowledge of Latin and Greek is up here. Shakespeare's is down here. Okay? So why 7 years? Why 7 years of silence between Shakespeare's death and this publication of the first folio? Why didn't anybody do it before? Well, we do know that there were attempts to publish some of Shakespeare's things in a collected edition earlier than 1623. And we do know some of Shakespeare's plays were published before then in, as I said, quarto form. Okay? But half of the plays don't show up until this book is published. And that causes, not in Shakespeare's day, not shortly after his death, but in the 19th century, that causes a group of people who become known as the anti-Stratfordians to start arguing that the guy who was born and died in Stratford-upon-Avon was not the person who wrote the plays. Yeah, the guy who was born in Stratford-upon-Avon was named William Shakespeare. And yes, the plays are attributed to somebody named William Shakespeare, but they're not the same person. And one of the reasons they say that, well, here are some of the reasons. One, the guy died in 1616. The plays aren't published till 7 years later. Why are there no commendatory poems on his death? That's taken as evidence that he's not the writer of the poems. Two, he didn't go to university. And only a university wit could have written these poems and plays. Okay? Three, the lost years. We don't know what Shakespeare was doing there during that period. How do we know that he was learning what he would have had to learn in order to write these poems and plays? Okay? Four, there are better choices for who Shakespeare really was. In other words, there are better possibilities of other writers who didn't go by the name William Shakespeare than the writer who did go by the name William Shakespeare to be the real William Shakespeare. Conspiracy theory? I mean, it's just crazy. And yet, some very big names in English literature follow this argument. George Bernard Shaw, not a slouch by any means, was an anti-Stratfordian. He said, there is no way William Shakespeare of Stratford could have written these plays. Ultimately, what this all boils down to, and I'm probably biased, I will say I'm biased, is it's an elitist charge. Put it in our world terms. This guy from Woodbury could not have written these plays. Because that's what Stratford-on-Warwick was to London. Think Woodbury to New York City. That's what Warwick, or what Stratford was to London. There's no way this country bumpkin could have written these plays, especially if he didn't have a university degree. And, use the American model. And what kind of university? Ivy League. He had to have gone. Whoever wrote these plays had to have attended the Harvard, Yale, or Princeton of his day. Oxford or Cambridge. Okay? So, various other people are suggested as the authors. Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Okay? Guess who the main proponents of the Earl of Oxford are? Descendants of the Earl of Oxford. Okay? Francis Bacon. Main proponents, descendants of Francis Bacon. There's nothing in the plays that suggests de Vere, Bacon, or any of the other people that have been suggested as the real Shakespeare are the real Shakespeare. There is evidence within the plays that the person who wrote the plays spoke with a Warwickshire dialect, as in the guy from Stratford. Because if you grow up and live in a place for 20 years, 1564 to at least 1585, that's close enough to 20 years, guess what? You don't lose those speech patterns all that easily. Okay? Those are kind of inbred in you at that point. Yeah, you can mask them, okay? But they're in your thought processes. In fact, even some of the vocabulary that Shakespeare uses in some of the plays. There's a bunch of books written about Shakespeare's language. Shows that, in many of the plays, specific words are Stratfordian dialect. Only somebody from the Stratford area would have chosen that word as opposed to a different word. Okay? Pretty good evidence. So, unless you want to say that only somebody who attends university can do something of this caliber, this is probably what... The founding artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London, a guy by the name of Mark Rylance, okay, who's become pretty big in about the last 5 years in terms of Hollywood films. Didn't do much before that in terms of film. But he was the founding artistic director from 1995 to 2005. Rylance came out with a book upon his leaving the tenure of that position. Big, tall book, really thin, just called, what's it called? It's either Play or The Play. And it's about his first 10 years, or about his years as the artistic director. Opening introduction, like the first page. He says Shakespeare isn't Shakespeare. And I'm like, my God, you're such a wonderful director and actor. How could you be so stupid? Because it just seems to me that he is. And he's a fantastic director and actor. When we do... Did I take it off? Yeah, I might change it. I had the 12th Night on here instead of Tempest. We might do 12th Night instead of Tempest. If we do 12th Night, I'm going to bring in video and show you, because in, what year was this? 2002. 2002, the Globe did a all original production of Twelfth Night. All original meaning they did it entirely in Elizabethan dress, costuming and everything, costuming entirely. And Mark Rylance played character of Countess Olivia. Okay, Richard Fry was in it. Stephen Fry was in it, who played Malvolio. The guy who plays in the latest Harry Potter films, not Grindelwald, the other one. No, the fantastic Eddie Redmayne. Eddie Redmayne plays one of the characters. It's before Eddie Redmayne was anybody. I know this because my wife and I saw it, and it's absolutely fantastic. In 2012, they did a revival of that same production. Eddie Redmayne wasn't in it, however, because by 2012, Eddie Redmayne was Eddie Redmayne, and he was no longer a nobody. Stephen Fry was in it, however, because Stephen Fry does not have a blown-up head. He's just an actor. He's just an everyday kind of ordinary person. But they then filmed that one. They didn't film the 2002 one. And so if we do 12th Night, I'm going to show portions of that, maybe even all of it, because it's one of Shakespeare's funniest comedies because of some things that happen to some of the characters. Okay, what else? A little bit about the theater. The first English theater built for actual going to a play had the very unique name of the theater. Built by James Burbage, who was the father of Richard Burbage, who was one of Shakespeare's partners in The Lord Chamberlain's Men and King's Men. Okay? So Burbage builds this theater in an area of London, outside London at the time, called Shoreditch. Today it's in London. Okay? If you were looking at a map of London, the Thames comes like this. Shoreditch is up here in the northeast side of London. You go almost directly south, a couple of miles, about 3 or 4 miles, and you go across the river and you come to Southwark, okay, which is on the south side of London today. In Shakespeare's day, it wasn't in London. So in 1575, Burbage leases land in Shoreditch. He doesn't buy it, he leases it. Okay? And he builds the theater. In 1598, the lease comes up. That is, they either have to release the land or they lose their control of it, not ownership. So they don't renew the lease. Instead, the Lord Chamberlain's men dismantled the theater, timber by timber, and they move it south of the Thames River into the area of Southwark. And they rebuild it, and they give it a new name, the Globe. Okay? This article that I'm going to post is about the work that's going on now at the archaeological site of the theater, because the foundations for the theater were discovered in 2008. Okay? And it's now an archaeological site, and it's all going to be developed, so they'll have shops and all this kind of stuff, and you'll be able to see the foundation. But they've found things there. For example, they've found an Elizabethan tankard. They found one of the pots that they're pretty sure is the pot that the money would be dropped in when you would go in, purchasing a ticket, etc., as well as other things. Right? So why did they move it south? Why did they move it literally outside the city limits? Well, in the mid-1590s, the Lord Mayor of London shut all the playhouses that were within the city limits. Why? A couple of reasons. One, plague had come back. It wasn't rampant like it was in the Middle Ages, the Black Death in the Middle Ages, but it was still rampant. How does plague spread? bodily fluids, that is coughing, sneezing, vomit, etc. And when people are in very close contact, like they were in the theater, it's real easy to spread. Okay? So that's one reason. That's a big reason. What's the other reason? Public morality. Because, you go see these actors and all kinds of loose stuff happens. Because right near the theater, you had the red light district. Okay? Prostitutes made a lot of money on theater goers. Either good time going in, good time coming out, one of the two. Okay? So they moved to Southwark because it's outside the Lord Mayor's reach. He can hem and holler all he wants. He cannot do anything to shut down the playhouses there. And you got three major ones. You've got the Globe, you've got the Swan. I can't remember the other one. Not the Dove. The Bear. There's three or four. If you go to the Globe Theater today, it was built using the exact same methods and materials as the original one was. I taught a course in London in 1595, just as they were completing. Of course, it had nothing to do with Shakespeare or the Globe, but I took my students, got permission. We got to go in while they're building and everything, walk on the stage. The whole thing is built exactly the same, with two differences. The seating accommodates modern bodies as opposed to Elizabethan bodies, because modern bodies are taller and wider. On average, an Elizabethan gentleman was about 5'6", 5'7", was considered normal height. I'm more normal height for a modern American male, 5'9", 5'10". Okay? We're significantly wider than they were, however. So the seating, which is built exactly the same, but it just, it doesn't accommodate as many people as it would have in Shakespeare's day. They crammed them in more because they were smaller bodies. That's one difference. Another difference is in the thatching of the roof. It is a thatched roof, just like Shakespeare had, but within the layers of the thatch, there is a fireproof, I want to say it's a layer of steel. Why? Because in 1612, I think it was, during a production of either one of the Henry VI or Henry VIII, shot off a cannon, blank. The wadding, however, shot out, landed on the roof, and burned the globe to the ground. So that can't happen. It can catch fire, but it's not going to burn down to the ground. Plus, there's, sprinkler systems. But if you go to the Globe, as opposed to going to see National Shakespeare Festival, if you go to the Globe and you're in the back of one of the galleries, you can hear very fine what is going on stage, even though they don't use any sound system. They have nothing to magnify or amplify their voices. That's, first of all, it's because of the quality of the actors. They know how to project. Okay? Plus, the Globe is a very intimate theater. From the stage to the farthest back point of the gallery, you are about the distance from the net in a tennis court to the baseline. It's not that big. Okay? For the yard, if this were the front of the stage, the yard where the groundlings stand would be maybe another 10 feet this way. But that crams about 1,000 people in it. Okay? And in Shakespeare's day, more than that. So you can hear everything that goes on. If you see the National Shakespeare Festival, they all use microphones. And one of the problems they have is every now and then, one of the mics kicks out. And if it's one of the kind of professional actors, you'll hear that person ramp up their voice and really project. If it's one of the apprentice actors, they don't know to do that, and they're talking like this, and there are people, who can't hear what's going on, right? What else? So, this real briefly. 37 plays, 154 sonnets, 4 long poems. In 52 years. No, not in 52 years, because he's not writing plays when he's a year old. All this is done in roughly 20 years. Maybe 22. If you want to say from 1590 to 1612. But still, just forget the sonnets and poems. 37 plays in 22 years. Comes out to what? It's about a play and a half per year. Wow. But what kind of play? A Shakespeare play. 5 acts. On average, these take about 4 hours to perform. Okay? Which is why if you go see the Nashville Shakespeare Festival, Midsummer Night's Dream, a little over 2.5 hours. Why? They cut a bunch. Okay? So if you do the extra credit thing, one of the things I'm going to ask of you is, how do they change the play? What's cut? What characters are reassigned? Kind of things like that. You go see it at the Globe, they don't cut. They're almost all, you could bring in a text there and read through almost the entire thing, except for when there's some ad-libbing going on. Because the actors will play off the audience. That's why they love audience involvement. My son's in the Nashville Shakespeare Festival, and when we're not there, which has been most nights because of my knee surgery, he'll come home and say, there are only 300 people, which meant the audience was dead. But when there's 1,000 people and the audience is alive, the actors just love it because they feed off that. It gives them energy. Here's an example. I'm trying to remember what time we get out of here. 9:25. When my wife and I were there in 2002, we saw a production of Midsummer Night's Dream, and I wish they had filmed this one. Because I think this is the greatest production of Midsummer Night's Dream I've ever seen, and I've seen 10 or 12. The guy who played Duke Theseus and Oberon was a Scottish actor. Think of Gerard Butler, when Gerard Butler was still young and handsome. Not that he's ugly or anything now. But, and my wife has a thing for Scots. One for the men and for the language, for the sound of the language. And for that play, we got tickets to 3 plays in. For that play, we got groundling tickets, which are standing. You try to sit at the Globe today, and one of the docents will come up and tap you and say, you have to stand or leave. Okay. So we got groundling tickets, and we got there early enough so that when they opened the doors, we rushed through. Now, my wife's about 5'1", 5'2" on a good day, if gravity's lesser, she might. And the stage is right about 55 inches or so. So just under 5 feet. So, and she can go up to the stage and rest her chin on it. Okay? And if this is the stage, we got dead center. So we're standing there, and the play's going on, and in the scene, we'll talk about it Tuesday probably, in the scene when Oberon comes out, after Puck has transformed Bottom's head to that of an ass, Oberon comes out and asks something along the lines, I wonder what Titania has seen or what has happened to her. And I can't remember the exact line. And my wife replied, because he came out and he looked right at us. And my wife said, and I'm like, Karen, shut the hell up. He's not asking you. And she's like, and he looks at her and he gets this big grin on his face. And he gets down on his knees right in front of her. And he is drop dead gorgeous. Okay? And he has this beautiful, rich, thick Scottish brogue. And she's just melting, gelling at his feet. And for about 2 or 3 minutes, they go back and forth. I mean, he just, no, yes. What happened? She fell in love with a man. No! And I'm like, because, we've got, 3,000 eyes right here. So that happens, and then he kind of winks at her when he gets up and goes off for the rest. And she says, and then later, at the end of the play, when they come out and take their bows, he kind of does this, she's still living off that money. Funny thing is, I've never seen him in anything else. He's a fantastic actor. He's one of the best, but I have never seen him in anything else. And I think it's because he is solely a stage actor. He doesn't do film, doesn't do television, just stage. Anything else? No, I don't think so in terms of background. So, in the few minutes we have left, hold on a second. Let's start A Midsummer Night's Dream. Where's the play set? Athens. And? The forest outside Athens. Okay? So you've got 2 settings. Shakespeare does this in many plays, especially in comedies. We're going to see the same thing in As You Like It. We have a courtly setting, and then we have a forest or wild setting outside there. Why Athens? Why not Rome? Why not London? Well, it's the characters. Theseus is an ancient Greek character, Greek myth. Hippolyta, another ancient Greek character, queen of the Amazons. Okay? And so what does Shakespeare give us at the beginning of a poem, at the beginning of a play? He sets up, the overarching plot. What is going to happen in 4 days' time? From the opening of the play. Theseus and Hippolyta are going to get married. Okay? That's the overarching plot. It's from that overarching plot that all the little subplots kind of fall out. Okay? So, we see Theseus and his train come in, and he says, "Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes." Why? Why does the old moon wane slowly for Theseus? He wants to get married. Okay? He wants 4 days to be gone. Hippolyta, 4 days will quickly steep themselves in night. Notice, moon, night. 4 nights will quickly dream away the time. That is, when 4 nights come, it'll be like the intervening 4 days were nothing but a dream. And then the moon, like to a silver bow now bent in heaven, shall behold the night of our solemnities. So Theseus tells Philostrate, his servant, "Stir up the Athenian youth. We want some merriment for our wedding night." He says, okay. So Theseus then introduces an idea of love, or use an old-fashioned terms, courting or wooing. How he wooed Hippolyta. "I wooed thee with my sword, and won thy love doing thee injuries." So how did he win her hand in marriage? Combat. He defeated her. Okay? He fought her, she lost. And keep in mind, the Amazons were not, pushovers. If you saw Wonder Woman, you know that, right? They were fierce. How fierce were Amazons, according to the myth? How crazy?
These are
Exactly. They would cut off their left breast. Why?
So they could draw their bow.
So they could draw their bow. I mean, that's crazy. Okay. He didn't woo her how? Soft songs. He didn't take her out to dinner. He didn't buy her gifts. He didn't send her cards. He beat her in battle.
And she loved him for it.
And she loves. Okay. So that's one kind of wooing or loving. One of the things Shakespeare does in this play, is he gives us varieties of experience of courtship or varieties of love. Okay? So, Aegeus comes in. Aegeus serves what purpose? Aegeus is Hermia's father. Okay? We've been told now, there's going to be a wedding 4 days' time. They're madly in love, kind of, in this weird martially aspect. And what does Aegeus introduce?
Conflict.
What kind of conflict?
Well, slightly romantic conflict. You got his daughter who's in love with someone, and that someone's in love with her, but then there's another someone who's in love with the daughter, and dad likes second somebody.
Exactly. We've got the love conflict, right? So we have Theseus, Hippolyta. Hermia is introduced. Who is Hermia in love with? Lysander. Okay. Demetrius is introduced. Who is he in love with? Hermia. And then we have Helena referred to, and she's in love with Demetrius. What other love pair do we have? We have Oberon and Titania. Okay? So, but this isn't really 5 groups, right? It's just, these two have got to get their act together. Okay? So, Aegeus introduces the wrinkle, the conflict. And he says, what? Hermia, my daughter, I want to marry Demetrius. Demetrius has my support. Lysander says, or Hermia says, but I love Lysander. Okay? Theseus, what say you, Hermia? Line 46, be advised, fair maid, to you your father should be as a god. What does he mean? Obey. You don't disobey Greek culture. You don't disobey the gods. If you know anything about Greek literature, what happens when you piss off a Greek god? Yeah. Usually slowly, horribly, painfully. It's never quick.
You've probably seen your family eat shreds around you too.
Yeah, exactly. Or you end up eating your family, as happens, with the Atreus myth and such. So, it's within his power to leave the figure or disfigure it. Demetrius is a worthy gentleman. Notice, come on, Hermia, Demetrius isn't bad. She's like, yeah, but so is Lysander. Well, yeah, in himself he is, but what does Lysander lack? Your father's voice. That is, your father's support. Your father's blessing. Okay? Therefore, the other must be held the worthier. I would my father look but with my eyes. Where should the emphasis be there? My. If you see the National Shakes production, the girl who plays the girl who plays Hermia will say, my eyes. That's wrong. The emphasis is on my. Why? Her eyes say what? Lysander. His eyes say Demetrius. I wished he looked with my eyes. Because if he looked with her eyes, what would his eyes do? Lysander. Rather, your eyes must with his judgment look. That is, love must be what? Her love is based on what? Hermia's love for Lysander is based on what? Is it looks? It's inward. It's passion. It's not that she has looked at Lysander and Demetrius and pulled out the legal pad, pros and cons. Because from everything we're told, pros and cons, they are what? They're equal. Okay? Hermia says, I'm sorry, I don't know what to come over me. Tell me, what's the worst I can expect? It's pretty bad, right? Well, Athenian law is you die. But he gives her another possibility. Actually, she has three options, right? One, wed Demetrius. Two, die. Three, become a nun. Not a Christian nun, but a nun to Diana. Who's Diana? Goddess of virginity. Goddess of chastity. Okay? So, marry Demetrius, die, or be a virgin the rest of your life. Okay? So what does he say? Question your desires. Know of your youth, examine well your blood. Whether if you yield not to your father's choice, you can endure the livery of a nun. What's he getting at? Can you not have sex for the entire rest of your life? He's assuming she hasn't had it yet. That's why he says, know of your youth. She's young and she's horny. And of your blood. Blood implies passion. To be in shady cloister mewed, to live a barren sister all your life, chanting faint hymns to the cold, fruitless. Notice, these aren't loud, full-throated hymns of celebration of virginity and chastity. These are faint. Woo, I'm glad to be a virgin. Whippy, you know. He says, blessed are those who can do that, but not many of us can do that. She says, so will I grow, so live, so die. I will do that before I yield my virgin patent up to him. Okay? He said, no, you don't have to answer right now. Tell you what, we're getting married in 4 days. Tell me in 4 days. So he's getting married in 4 days. Should be a day of celebration, joy, etc. But now, on that day, Hermia has to either marry somebody she doesn't want to marry or agree to marry that person. 2, agree to die. Or 3, agree to be a virgin for the rest of her life. What kind of effect is that going to have on that day's joyous celebrations? Demetrius, really relent, sweet Hermia. Lysander, yield thy crazed title to my certain right. You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermia's. Do you marry him? No. Notice, that's a laugh line. Now, the groundlings standing in the pit are rolling on the floor laughing at that because they get what Shakespeare's, getting at. The hint of homosexuality. You marry him. Let me have her. Nashville Shakes makes a change there. I won't talk about it. Just scornful Lysander. In other words, Aegeus doesn't like the joke. He hath my love. And so Lysander says what? I am as well derived as Demetrius is. That is, our family lineages are of equal depth. I have as great a social status as he does. My fortunes is fairly ranked. That is, I've got as big a bank account as he does. If not with vantage, in fact, if I'm not a little wealthier than he is. And more importantly, she loves me. So I've got more than Demetrius does. Lastly, what does he pull out as his ace? Demetrius made love to Nader's daughter, Helena. Doesn't mean made love, had sex. It means he wooed. See, wooing is important. The act of it. He wooed and won her heart. Theseus says, yeah, I heard about that. I meant to talk to you about that, Demetrius. So, they leave, and we have Lysander and Hermia left on the stage. Lysander comes up with an idea. What's the idea? This is further complication or conflict.
Run away to my aunt.
Let's run away to my dowager aunt who lives where?
Outside of the Duke's reach. On the other side of the woods.
In the wood, outside Athens. Law. So Athens equals law. So then what does the wood equal? Anarchy? Freedom. Anarchy. I heard this word, chaos. Freedom. This is law, reason, civilization. Anarchy, chaos, freedom, wildness. Okay? So, Hermia introduces the idea of true lovers being crossed. Line 150. If then true lovers have been ever crossed, it stands as an edict in destiny. What does she mean by that? This is what happens. This is often what happens in Shakespeare's plays, both comedies and tragedies. Who often stands between a daughter who is in love with a suitor? Dad. It's the father who stands in the way. It's not mom. Okay? I don't know if there's autobiographical stuff there or Shakespeare stood in the way of Susanna, but she married. Okay? It stands as an edict in destiny. Then let us teach, line 152, our trial patience, because it is a customary cross. What does she mean when she says it is a customary cross? It's not peculiar to them. Other lovers have gone through the same problem. How do we know? Look at the play within the play at the end of the play. The lamentable comedy or whatever it is of Pyramus and Thisbe. Why do Pyramus and Thisbe not live happily ever after? Their parents stopped them from loving. Okay? And we could talk about the lion and that stuff later. It's a customary cross. That is, guess what? This is something many young people have to go through. Okay? So Lysander says, therefore, let's do what? Go away. Let's elope. So, they agree to do that. Helena comes in. Hermia tells Helena. Hermia and Lysander leave. Helena gets a soliloquy. What's important about a soliloquy? What is the actor doing when the actor delivers a soliloquy? Soliloquy is when you have one actor on the stage.
Other actors don't know what's going on.
Yeah, because there are no other actors on the stage. So, what is the purpose of the soliloquy for the audience?
It's to let the audience know that particular character's innermost thoughts.
Exactly.
It's like thinking out loud.
Exactly. The soliloquy is the actor thinking out loud. We know what that person really thinks and believes. There's no play acting in a soliloquy. Oddly enough, what is often called the greatest soliloquy in the English language is not a soliloquy. To be or not to be. It's not a soliloquy. Why not?
Speaking it to a ghost?
No. There's somebody else on the stage when Hamlet delivers that. Ophelia is on the stage. Okay? She hasn't left. So when Hamlet delivers that, if we go by the strict definition of a soliloquy, that's not a soliloquy. which is why some directors will indicate to us it's not a soliloquy, because they'll have Hamlet come out and he'll just give a little look up and he sees Ophelia. Is that the indication that everything that follows is all part of the act? We'll talk about that when we get there. So, Helena goes on and talks about love and how love occurs and where love comes from. And she says, 232, things base and vile, holding no quantity, love can transpose to form and dignity. What does she mean? Love, on the part of the person who is the lover, can transpose something else, the thing beheld, that is base and vile, into what? Something that is beautiful and noble. Notice, it's not the thing being beheld that does the transforming. It's the beholding that does the transforming. Well, what did she say to Aegeus about her father? I wish my father looked but with my eyes. If he looked with her eyes, then what would happen? He would choose Lysander. Lysander, currently base and vile in Aegeus' eyes, would become full of form and dignity. Love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind. Now that kind of sounds like love, therefore, is what? Which of these would it fall under? Reason. That love is rational. And therefore, is winged Cupid painted blind? Right? Cupid doesn't go up to people and go, oh, there she is. And I'm going to make her fall in love with, Cupid's like, well, Stevie Wonder. Bing, and it flies. And whoever gets hit, sorry. Nor hath love's mind of any judgment taste of judgment. Wings and no eyes figure in needy haste. And therefore love is said to be a child, because in choice he is so oft beguiled. In other words, love does what? It just smacks you upside the head, whether you want it to or not. Okay? So she goes on and says she's going to do what? I'm going to tell Demetrius. He's going to come follow Hermia, and I'm going to follow Demetrius. Why? Why will she follow Demetrius when she knows he doesn't love her?
She's hoping that he will give up on Hermia, and then here she is.
And why else? Because love, looking on something base and vile, transforms it. She's hoping she can transform Demetrius. Okay? All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with Act 1, Scene 2, our first introduction to the mechanicals, on Tuesday.